Reactive Training Systems.
Welcome back to the RTS podcast. I am Mike Tushir, and today Coach Mel and I are going to be talking to Kedric Kwan. Kedric of Reformance Training is the coach of Emil, who was the second place podium finisher at the 2025 Sheffield competition. Kedric is also a coach of Kyoto Ushiyama, the former world record holding powerlifter in the 66 class. And we've done quite a few podcasts with Kedric over the years. It's always really enjoyable to talk to him about training related topics. And then, of course, we pretty reliably veer into conversations that are a little more philosophical in nature about coaching broadly and just other topics that seem like they're maybe tangentially related, but are pretty important if you want to do the job well. So I really appreciate Kedric being on the podcast this time around. We get to talk about the Sheffield competition itself, how things went, some of the calls and decisions that he made as a coach, and then also Emil's prep and leading up to this. This was a really big finish for Emil to place second and to come in ahead of Gustav Hedlund. It's a big deal for him. So yeah, really enjoyable conversation, and I'm always glad to talk training with Kedric. And shout out to our mutual friend here, Matt Gary, who is going to be listening to this podcast as he goes on some walks in Montana. Matt always has to listen to my voice on 2x speed, but then he's going to have to slow it down for Kedric whenever Kedric talks. So have fun with that one, Matt. All right, without any further delay, let's get into the conversation here. Zero fun on this podcast.
The one funny thing on conversion with the plates is that when you go from being a gym bro to a lifter, your idea of a 3-plate lift changes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, blue plates are still pretty impressive, I guess. But yeah, and
well, there's the one gym that I went to in Sheffield had red 20-kilo plates. And I thought that's just trickery.
That should be illegal.
Right.
yeah.
I wonder how they decided on like the color convention for plates. Like, I wonder if that was fairly arbitrary or was there, thought and intention behind it.
In weightlifting, the 25 kilo and the 2.5 kilo plates are the same color. And the 15 kilo and 1.5 plates are the same color. Instead of black and silvers.
Yeah.
I mean, it also depends on the brand, right? Because you have like the most annoying ones are those plates that are silver in color, but the middle is like red, But when you the outer and everything is silver,
edges,
like those those like TSS plates or something like that. I'm like, cool. Now I literally cannot see what's on the bar. Like I have no idea what is on the bar. It just looks like a bunch of silver stuff, and it looks really thin as well, right? So it's from far, it does look slightly thinner than like the calibrated plates. So you probably can't really tell even like whether that's 25 or 20s. So I'm like, cool. Now we completely have no idea. Confuse the muscle and confuse the crowd at the same time.
Muscle doesn't know how much weight. Maybe it'll be okay.
Yeah, I think the TSS plates that they used at the USAPL Nationals a couple years ago were like a chrome disc, but it like had one like colored band around it or something. But yeah, they looked great up close. Would have been awesome to have like in a gym, but like from far away and in pictures and stuff, it makes it difficult to see how much is on the bar.
Yeah, when you're watching lifter recaps and they're not telling you their lift, they're like, yeah, it was a good squat. Then you zoom in and you try and count.
Just like more effort than I'm putting into most like casual videos that I'm just gonna watch. Yeah.
Apparently, the plates, the color of the plates was supposed to correspond with the rings of the Olympics. You know, like the colors of the rings.
Oh, I
Yeah.
like how you probably just Googled that. You're like, I'm going to investigate this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because and the green is like usually the greens are like 50, right? So apparently they're supposed to be according to like the rings of the Olympics. So apparently that's what it is.
Interesting. That makes sense.
Fun fact.
Well, now hopefully a lot more people will know.
Yeah, to like drop it
Yeah.
into a casual conversation in a party. Like, do you guys know what?
Right. And they'll be like, what's powerlifting?
Is that like in the Olympics where you bring the bar over your head?
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
kidding. I don't have friends that aren't powerlifters.
That's every conversation I have with whenever I travel overseas and the Uber or Bolt driver say, "Oh, what are you here for?" I was like, "Oh, powerlifting." Then they say, "Oh, when are you going to go to the Olympics?" I'm like, "No, let's start all over. We are not an Olympic sport."
Right. Never gonna be one. Little do they know that they've inadvertently stepped into a very difficult conversation.
Yep.
You're so nice. I would say, yeah,
Yeah.
just yes.
Just say something impressive. Yeah. Well, anyway,
Awkward
that's-
segue into the agenda.
I'm out of humorous banter. I've run dry, so I've got nothing left except the agenda. So, so obviously, Kedric wanted to talk to you about Sheffield and about coaching, and I'm not sure how many podcasts we've done together at this point, but been quite a few. So we've
Yep.
got to talk about training related stuff in the past. But this time, we were both there, both at Sheffield, although I think you've been to all the Sheffields up to this point, which is pretty cool. And, I think this was your first one as a coach, though. Is that like as like a lifter coach? Like you've been there in like a nutrition capacity in the past.
Now, the first one Emil qualified for, right? He didn't do that well because he was injured. So, but I still was there putting the numbers. Last year, I was there for Kyoto,
Gotcha.
and then this year was Emil again. So for all three,
Well, my
I've been
mistake.
like submitted numbers to a certain extent. Yeah.
No, my mistake. I didn't know that you'd been working with Emil for that long.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. How long have you been working with Emil?
2 years. Sheffield was actually it's funny because when we started working together, Sheffield was actually our first meet. So prior to, yeah, I know,
It's a
right?
hell of a way to get it going.
Yeah, prior to that, like
No
Emil
pressure.
decided to start working together after Euros, where it was the Euros after South Africa. So the South Africa where Emil got second, right, to Chance Mitchell, and then that after that Euros, he bombed out and he was injured during that prep. After that Euros, he messaged me, but due to some inefficiencies in the Bulgarian Powerlifting Federation, he actually already had the wildcard invite, but it was stuck in the federation email and he didn't get it, and he wasn't notified. And then he was notified much later, even later than the supposedly closing date where the lifters had to respond if they were to accept the invite or not, right? So if I'm not mistaken, if my memory is right, because the lifters were supposed to accept the invite around 15th or 17th of December, but when Emil got the email, it was already like 27 or 28 of December. So I told Emil to immediately message Pete, and thankfully the spot wasn't filled yet, and then Emil managed to sort of like get that Sheffield wildcard confirmation in time, way past the actual time, but in time before the spot was filled. So I'm like, yo, cool, right? We started working together without knowing that we were going to go to Sheffield, right? Or he was going to go to Sheffield, and then found out couple of weeks later that the first meet that he'll be competing in will be Sheffield. So yeah, and obviously he was injured as well, so it was the prep was actually very, very different. We only had like 6-7 weeks then to prep, because like I said, December 28, a couple of weeks later, like 7 weeks later, it was like March, right? So because the first Sheffield was around March, so
yeah.
So Sheffield theoretically was our first meet together, and yeah, so 2 years later, I mean, here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And after
And
that European, it was only, what, 7 months? 8 months of working together, if I look at the dates? If you
So
grabbed you after Europeans. Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, we started like right after like Europeans and then it's 2022, right? Because the first Sheffield was 2023. So
Yeah, sorry.
yeah, so 2022, and then Sheffield 2023. Then Emil didn't go to Sheffield in 2024, all right, and then he's back again in 2025.
well, that's really awesome. Yeah, that was actually on my list of questions here because I didn't realize that you guys had been working together for that long. That's got to be it's a hell of a way to start a coaching relationship, but it's got to be pretty satisfying to, you know, have worked with him and kind of, eh, I'm sure, agonize alongside of him and then kind of get back to the stage where you guys were at and been so close to winning such big titles along the way, and then for it to come together on the day that you guys had, and that's got to feel really good for you.
Yeah, I mean, it felt good, right? For sure. Like the crazy things that sometimes things like this were like not really planned for. I mean, sure, we had in mind a certain realistic total, but for that total to actually put Emil on the podium, right, and not just on the podium, but arguably on that day the best total other than Chell, which is a league on its own, right? We
Yeah.
didn't really plan for that. I don't think any preview show actually placed any of the 93s on the podium, so that itself was pretty good. I think the joy, so the joy of like seeing the lifter you coach being sort of like happy with the outcome, right? Like it's good
Yeah.
because I mean, like every competition that we do or that Emil competes in, of course he wants to win, right? So this is technically the first one that he won because the only other 93 kilo lifter is Gustav, right? So this is the only competition that he went head to head since we worked together that he beat Gustav. Obviously he beat Gustav in South Africa in 2022 when he got second, but we weren't working together. But after that, every single competition we've done together, sort of like Gustav has kind of like beaten him. I mean, it's not just Gustav; it's just like there was always another 93 kilo lifter that's better than Emil, right? In this current phase off, at least, based on the official total, right? Not looking at what could have been done or how much strength is left in the tank for each one or the other lifter, right? Obviously, Emil sort of like came up on top just by a bit, right? So I think that the culmination of that and seeing how Emil was happy with the results, right, is very different because we had Sheffield. The first meet that we did was Sheffield 2023, right? Obviously, with the injury, he totaled like 835 or 837.5, right? Which is something quite low, but it was the best that we could do then. And then we went to Worlds in Malta. I think he totaled 875, right? So pretty decent improvement, right? I think Gustav totaled 877.5 or something like that. And then I think that was when Kaiko totaled 884 or something around that range. So there's always like, oh yeah, now after this competition, there's something. The response is like, oh yeah, I didn't do as well because there's these two other people that have beaten me, right? And then in Lithuania was the same, right? Gustav and Emil both total 895, right? But Gustav won because of the lighter body weight, right? And I mean, for those that watch the competition, that the last deadlift like slipped out of Emil's hand, which will put him at 905 total, and then there's always like, okay, cool, now that after what all that's happened, there's still that someone that has beaten me, but now it's like everything that has done, technically like nobody has beaten me, so it's more of like I have to kind of like think about it myself whether this is a result that I can be happy with internally, because now there's not like externally, I am theoretically the best 93 kilo lifter with the best 93 kilo official IPF. I mean, I have the world record total, right? So there hasn't been any other 90 meets that people had the opportunity to hit a higher total than that. So it's more of like, okay, cool. Now think about like all those like people that's beaten me in the past, I cannot like say like however I'm feeling now is attributed to all of that. It's more of like how do I feel internally, and I think therefore that expression that Emil shows is, I can say that it's a genuine expression that is coming from within based on how he truly feels without any like external sort of like external influence, right? So at least that's kind of like the way I kind of like perceive his expression. Obviously, this is everything that just going on in my head. He might be just be like, yeah, cool, I'm very happy, and it's very simple. You don't have to overcomplicate things. But at least that's kind of like how I view it.
Especially when you've been chasing people for so long and it's been a few years of chasing people, then finally you cut out ahead and you realize you're in front. And that's got to be a moment for a lifter.
Yeah.
I would imagine it's a good spot to be in. You could frame it however you want, like he came out on top, so that's worth feeling good about. But then if you find yourself in need of, you're coming into a training session, you need a little something to get you fired up or get you focused or something like that. Like, you don't have to look far, it's not like you're off by yourself and, to use the phrase you used earlier, like a league of your own, like that hasn't happened yet. So there's still plenty of motivation to be drawn from, So that's a good spot to be in. It can kind of be whatever you need it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
someone's always posting a good training session.
Sure. I wanted to kind of talk about Emil's day at Sheffield a little bit and just kind of hear from your perspective, from a coaching perspective. How did you feel about the performance overall? I mean, obviously, you guys ended up second on the podium, and that's a great spot to be in, especially at a competition like that. But more or less, did you guys land where you wanted on all the lifts, or how did you have to make adjustments along the way? How did it shake out for you?
Yeah, I mean, Emil got 2 of his thirds, right? So, I mean, he went 7 for 9 because he missed two lifts, but
more than most, I think.
Yeah. But he got his like third deadlift, right? Even though he missed the second, right? So when we look at kind of like the lifts, at least if we were to talk about strength, so obviously because there's only so much you can kind of control, right? So obviously whatever technical changes or technical flaws or bad habits that has been accumulated across the training blocks, you probably would not fix it on competition day. Like if someone consistently doesn't hit that in training all the time, it's probably going to be very difficult to fix it given the same load. If people, and all that kind of stuff. So let's kind of like evaluate purely from a strength perspective, because whatever he's doing on that day, leading to the warm-ups and all that, right? I'm looking at it purely from a strength perspective. And personally, I think that the numbers spoke for itself. So Emil, when I coach Emil, we use, a velocity track, right? And during Emil's warm-ups as well. So we attach the velocity, right? So I have all the numbers that Emil has, right? During his warm-ups, I think he's like all the past data points of, sessions that are good, right? Which session result in like the most weight lifted, right? And I look at all the warm-ups, maybe a second session where it's like, he's strong, but not that strong. And obviously a session where he's fatigued, right? So I look at the speed of all the warm-ups going into those sessions. And then when Emil's warming up, I try to like cross-reference it with whatever his velocity on those lifts are, right? And I would say that for the squat, bench, and deadlift, the velocities were very, very much. The squat is basically the best it has been, right? So as we were warming up, I told Emil, I said like, it's a little bit of a joke, right? Because Emil's goal was to have fun. And I think some people commented that Emil looked like he's having fun on the platform, which is great because it essentially shows that you're enjoying yourself. Emil was in the platform, he was joking. In the warm-up room, he was joking with me saying that how can you let Sonita open heavier than me? Because Sonita opened at 295. And initially our warm-up was 292.5. So I said, if you move the bars fast enough, right? Like then I can move your openers to 295. So yeah, the speed for the warm-up of the squats was slightly faster than what I expected. So I should bump it up to 295. It gave me like that confidence. I said, okay, cool. Now you're opening at the same weight as the best female squatter, in probably whole of IPF, right? Cool. Be happy.
That's amazing.
So
if you want to open up higher, just try harder.
Yeah. I'm like,
it works.
So that was what we did, right? So the squat warm-ups were slightly faster. I would probably say that the bench initially the bench when we were starting, the bench was the same with the lower weights, but it was slightly slower when it went to like the higher loads. Not sure whether it's because of the bench, right? Obviously using a hard illegal bench. It could be that, or it could be the fact that, I mean, Emil would be the first to admit that during training as well, he doesn't pause as long. And when you don't pause as long and you do a sync bench, it's very different, because essentially when you're syncing in the bench press, right, you have some momentum, right? So if you look at sticking point, right, if you have enough momentum or enough force to break past the sticking point, you can actually overcome it with the momentum you gain from the sync. But if you're not, but if you're pausing long enough and that momentum from that sync is reduced, it might not be enough force to break past the sticking point and you just fail, right? So it could potentially be that, right? Whereas the slight drop in speed might be just because the pauses in training was different, right? Compared to when I'm giving the calls, right? But it wasn't like a big difference, it's like maybe 0.01 meters per second or 0.02. It's nothing too significant that I had to like drastically change the openness, right? So we just went with the game plan. Missed his last bench at 240, right? Maybe in hindsight we should have just put 237.5. Maybe he would have gotten that. He might have grinded it out, or he might not. But deadlift was really good, right? So deadlift was the more surprising lift, because the velocities were actually much quicker than all his training. And that is actually a surprising thing, because when Emil deadlifts in training, he doesn't squat beforehand, right? And he didn't squat 317. He doesn't squat 317.5 and then go to a heavy deadlift, right? So to see the velocities be quicker than what he do during his training, that kind of indicates that the deadlift is feeling strong, at least from a purely strength perspective. And then obviously with Emil did 355 in training and we loaded 365, and that was the third pull. So I would say that those numbers were well within range based on what we discussed. So I would probably say that if we were to get, like, I would probably say 925 was the absolute maximum that Emil we would actually have on that day. And that would be 2.5 more on the squat, and Emil getting the 240 on the bench press. That would come out to 925. So we were close, and
Yeah.
obviously from a perspective of a attempt selection thing, right? I rather lose 2.5 kilos on the squat and maybe not grind and cook him in for the deadlift, because obviously Emil's last deadlift wasn't the easiest in the world. So if he maybe had 2.5 kilos on the squat, he might not have whatever he had on the day to actually lock out that last 365. So yeah, I think that within acceptable range, right, was anywhere from like 915 to 925, and yeah, we fell at 917.5. So
it's a very tight range, by the way, 915 and 925. It doesn't leave a lot of margin on any of the lifts, honestly, as things come in. But well done to both of you guys for that. Just kind of looking at some of the results, because I wasn't able to watch it as closely as I would have liked to, coaching as well. You guys missed your second deadlift and then had to go up anyway to reach for the podium. Were you apprehensive about that? I mean, you have to be a little bit, because there's just a lot riding on that pull, but at the same time, like, did you consider any other numbers?
So I think Emil made it really simple for me, right? Emil, prior to going onto the platform, I mean, even prior to the warm-ups, right? Prior to weigh-ins, we discussed the goals, right? And I just pose hypothetical situations, and let's just say that, what if we have to load this number, right? And okay, so sorry, before putting the cart before the horse, Emil just said his goal is to beat Gustav, right? And it's nothing between Gustav and Emil. It's just that he wants to beat the other 93. It could be any other 93, and Emil would just say, I want to beat that person. So Emil say, I don't really care about the placing as long as I come out as the top 93. So if Gustav got number 9, Emil will be happy with 8. If Gustav was 11, Emil will be happy with 10, And then I asked Emil, what if, let's just say if Gustav was 5th, and you are currently in like 8th place, and if I put something less but you don't beat Gustav but you get 6th place, he said, no, I don't want that. I just want to that is my main goal, right? So going out, I didn't realize how close we were. I know that we will probably not be 8 or 9, right? After the second attempt, I mean, actually not true. Gustav would probably not be 8 or 9. We would probably still be there if we missed our thirds because we didn't get our seconds, you know? So I'm like, I don't know where Gustav would fall in, because after that, we still have, people like, there are only a couple of lifters that pull heavier than Emil, which is, I think Ashton, Ade, and Jesus, right? So those are the 3 lifters that pull more, right? So, but I kind of knew that, probably we fall somewhere in the middle of the pack, 5 or 6, but I didn't realize that even if that by beating Gustav would end up third and Emil would be second. So there wasn't really any, like, I just discussed, I said, like, tell me what you think you can have. Then I said, like, we just load up 365. Initially, the attempt was slightly lower. And then obviously there was an attempt switch, right? If you were looking at the scoreboard, there was an attempt switch. And then I had to move up the attempt, right? So that was the goal, right? The goal was always just to come out as the number 193 in that competition. So it kind of like made it simple for me. We weren't thinking about, cool, I mean, how much money, we're gonna do, how much does this pool cost, right? I think that it does kind of show that I think you just kind of like, you have the narrative that you want, you have that motivation internally, right? And that to Emil shooting for the stars and missing is probably, I mean, at least at that point, it was worth more to him than whatever small amount you climb in placing in terms of like that money you can get. He said, yeah, sure, the money is nice, but whatever, and it's nice when you get both, right? So, and that was the outcome that we had. So that was really, really nice to see.
Yeah, skillful lifting and strong quality powerlifter ends up getting rewarded in a competition like that. So it definitely simplifies your job a bit to be aiming at somebody in the same weight class. You can just simply aim to out total them and not have to worry about a bunch of other like numerical conversions and stuff, given the scoring system difference. But still, like, you've got to put it on the bar, and then the lifter has to make the pull. I saw Emil's third deadlift. I thought it looked good at the time. I've watched dozens of replays. I think they all look good, to be honest. It's surprising to me that some people don't think it looks good. Like, it's one of those where I look at it and I go, I don't see what you could be looking at here. Like, I kind of consider myself kind of a picky judge on deadlifting as well. So I'm not sure really where that controversy could come from. But I remember seeing you and Emil both kind of on the live stream a little bit. It looked like maybe you were nervous at the beginning that maybe there might be a jury overturn.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That, I mean, sure, right? There's always going to be some criticism when people evaluate it from the larger context of things, right? I'm not sure about the female deadlifts, but apparently there was some, sketchy calls in the females as well. I didn't watch it, obviously, because I was helping Emil warm up, putting the attempts, right? So, and I haven't really had the time to actually sit down and go through the entire competition, So I think that based on how everything went, people would, evaluate in those contexts, and people will kind of like, like compare it from one lifter to another. It's, this lifter has gotten it, and therefore, if this pass, this should pass as well, right? But I think the biggest thing, people put out there is like saying that, Russ was robbed, and obviously Russ is a really popular lifter. He has a lot of fans, right? And his fans are you have a very typical like archetype of Russ fans, which are young men, and young men, they tend to be a little bit more outspoken on social media, right? Just, willing to take the risk and put their comments out there, right? Let's just put it
nicely put.
Yeah.
Nicely put.
And that is like, empirically, that is also true for his fans being young men, because if you were at the meet and greet, you see his line is so freaking long. Like Russ's line is like so long, and like you just look, like a quick glance would just tell you, okay, cool, majority of it will be young men or boys, to see Russ. And obviously comparing it to Russ and Emil, right, I think that made kind of like the controversy or the conversation a little bit spicier, right? But I think that when it comes to lifting, as someone who is a ref, right, myself, I'm not a international ref because I haven't sat for my exam, but I've refs at multiple nationals, right, and also being a coach, I would also know, and also as a coach, I think that as a midday coach, not only do you need to know how to put the right attempts, but you also need to find the best way to allow your lifter to basically get the most attempts. And not getting the most attempts is not just about putting the right number, but sometimes, trying to, if there's a 50-50 call, trying to persuade the jury to actually either, to flip the call, right? You need to know how to contest that. And the best way, like, people come up to me and, we talk about stuff, some people came up to me after that and say like, oh yeah, congratulations to Emil, but you should probably avoid any referees for the next 3 months. I'm like, so you just basically really wanted to say that the lift was bad, but you said congratulations at the start. I was like, cool, that's fine, But when we look at the entire context of things, and this has always been, the jury's role in the competition has always been quite contentious, right? Especially at Worlds, where the jury was slightly more active in the 47 kilo female class, where there were so many overturns on the bench press, right? And then some, lifters, got bombed out because of that reason. Multiple good lifts get overturned. So I think that if I were to evaluate this, right? So I think the first thing, like, I'm going to make the case out here, why I think that the lift is good within the context of the competition. And first of all, I would say that the first thing first is that if anyone tells me that the lift should be bad because Emil looks surprised that he got the lift, right? Therefore, it should be bad. I say, like, every exam that I have passed in my life that I'm surprised I got it, that means that I should have failed all my exams, and that's a lot of exams that I was surprised I managed to pass back in my high school days. And I think, like, just because someone looks surprised doesn't mean that he thinks he or she doesn't feel that they should get a lift, right? He might be surprised for other reasons. The lift was not an easy lift, right? And whatever emotions or expressions people show on the platform, unless you are a mind reader with a very, very high level of accuracy, you probably have no idea what's going through their head. The lifter themselves might not even have an idea what's going through their head. If you listen to the podcast where Emil said, I said, like, for the next 15 minutes, I actually had no idea what was happening when I was in the VIP, the meet and greet. Then, when things started to, simmer down, I then started to process things, so he couldn't even articulate what the lift was like, because it was just so, it's such a highly charged event.
Blur.
Yeah. So the point that, just because someone looks surprised they got the lift, therefore it should not have been a good lift, I think it's like a really, really bad argument. Because if you want to tell me why it shouldn't be a good lift, we point out the specific technical flaws that should be an issue, then we can discuss about that. So then we can, to move on to the technical issues, like I said, the lift doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be like, oh, you move your third lift as an RP 8.5, it looks super good, then, to get 3 white lights, therefore it's a good lift. In the context of lifting, you only need 2 white lights for it to be considered a good lift. And then it then goes to the jury, right? And it goes to the same thing for squats. Let's say someone has really, like, asymmetrical hips, and they can never get hit. They will never hit that on one side, even though the other side is that, right? So they will get the front and maybe the right, and that's 2 lights. That's enough to actually pass for a good lift, right? So for people that say, Emil soft lockout, technically, you only need to lock out convincingly for 2 referees to give you the lights. And then it's up to the jury, right? And then it then goes back to the question of the role of the jury, right? What do you want the jury to be? Do you want the jury to be a very active jury that has a lot of jurisdiction to overturn any lift and essentially render the roles of the referee, obsolete?
Useless.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because we've seen that before and people complain all the time. Or do you want a jury to only do something when it's so egregious that they have then they would have to overturn? And then in that case, I think that the jury system of a three person jury is actually really good, because it has to be unanimous, meaning that it has to be to the point where if there's for example, if you look at it for let's say it's a 2-1, right? Meaning that 2 referees have agreed that it's good, right? To overturn that from a good lift to a bad lift, you need 3 juries to say that it is really, really bad. So, which means 3 juries plus 1 ref, right? Say it's a bad lift, so it's a 4-2 decision because 2 referees said it's good, right? So that means that it's so bad that the majority, right, a large majority, more than half, thinks that it's a bad lift, and therefore it's overturned, right? And so happened, Emil got the lift from good, and it wasn't so egregious that it could be overturned. And the flip side is the same. If you have a bad lift, right, with a less active jury, it also means that a bad lift to overturn it to be a good lift is also harder. It just so happens that in this case, like, because for Emil's second deadlift, right, Emil didn't get the deadlift. I went up to the jury, right, and actually one of the jury didn't agree, right, with the other 2 of the juries, right, and the jury gave me the reason. The jury said it was for supporting the bar on the thighs, which I'm like, you really can't do that on a sumo deadlift, but it's okay. I'm not going to argue with you. But all it was for one jury to not be convinced and the lift wasn't overturned. So from the context of the competition, whether you get a good lift or a bad lift, it is hard to change the decision of the referee. And because the role of the jury is not to play, like to render the role of the referee obsolete. So I think that is how it should be. So in the context of everything, the lift should be good. So that's kind of like my long defense. If I were to make a case, Your Honor, this is the case, right? This is what I would do. And so far, I think that it's easy to, first of all, everybody that's looking at the deadlift from the stream had no idea what's going on, because you cannot even see when the ref gave the commands, because on the stream you cannot see the referee, you just look at the lift. So a lot of their sort of like opinions, first of all, is based on what they can see, and then they also do not take into account the larger picture of the role of the referee and the jury combined. So I think collectively, if I can make the case that way, I'm like, I think I've made quite an ironclad case on why Emil's lift should be good. And if anyone out there is willing to kind of challenge me on these grounds, by all means, whatever points, I'm more than happy to kind of like engage in a good faith spirited conversation. So yeah,
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you're right about like the structure of the judging and the referees, and I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I also think like this particular case has a simpler read as well, where like I look at what I can see, and shoulders, hips, knees are in line. That's locked out. Like the complaint that I hear from people who want to talk about they think that the lift wasn't good. The complaint is that they didn't feel like it was locked out. I don't know what more you can get than that. Like we've seen before where it's just not a requirement that you like overextend. Like that's just not the requirement. You lift until you're fully upright, and if you're upright but leaning back because it's 365 kilos and you weigh 93, then that doesn't mean that it's not locked out or anything like that. Like I just don't, I'm not unable to look at that video and even see where another point of view is coming from. So that's the only reason why I'm even really bringing it up and talking about it for so long here. But I thought it was definitely a good lift. It looked great, and I was glad to see him make the lift. And I've been kind of watching Emil for a long time, and seeing him put together things and put together really incredible totals. And then for some reason, different reasons in different comps, something happens and it just doesn't quite fully come together for him. So it was really good to see this one stick, despite the call in the second attempt.
Yeah, we've not gotten all three deadlifts before. So the first Sheffield, Emil, actually all our competitions together, Emil missed all his third deadlifts. First Sheffield, he missed his third deadlift. The second one, he missed it. The first Sheffield, which first comp, he missed his third. It was a 2-1. The first Worlds in Malta, he missed it to grip, and then, we know what happened in Lithuania, he missed it to grip as well. So it's nice to know, right, that for this 365, in his head, it's like, I'm going to hold on until like, I don't care, until the world ends, right? I'm not going to let go of this deadlift ever again, So even though we haven't got all three of our deadlifts, it's nice to know that the last deadlift that we pulled wasn't due to a grip issue. So that was good.
So what have you done to work on that grip issue?
I mean, we've tried everything. I think we, at one point, we tried mixed grip a little, right? And I think that a little bit context for Emil is that the reason why Emil started working with me was because he was suffering from injury on his, somewhere around his upper back. So that area where, you put the bar on when you squat gets slightly inflamed, right? And it's painful, right? And there are certain positions, other stuff as well, when that would kind of aggravate that area while we were doing mixed grip. I think because of the asymmetrical grip on one hand, right, on the right hand, right, where that kind of aggravates his back as well, right? So while I think that the heaviest we've done was 320 for doubles mixed grip, which is pretty good and secure, but that was the most he could tolerate. So we tried mixed grip, and then I just said, there are a couple of like options for you, right? I know you don't like mixed grip, because you don't feel as good, but you've been missing you lost to Gustav twice at Worlds because of your grip issues, so we have to find a way to overcome it. And I know if you don't like mixed grip, then we just have to do hook grip more. So I just said, yeah, cool. You just have to pull hook grip more often. You either choose, right? Like pulling hook grip more is painful for your thumbs, but mixed grip is painful for your back, right? Which is the outcome where you think that you would be able, it's a trade-off, right? Which is a trade-off you think you can kind of like accept. And then we did more hook grip work. So previously in the past, Emil would only hook grip top singles, and I said specifically top singles because even when he do a top triple, right, he will still use straps, right, and all his back offs he will use straps. And I tell this to all the to the lifters that I work with and I coach. I said that whether you use a mixed grip or hook, it's a tool, right? And I just say that generally I feel like you should be able to hook grip 50% of your sets. Because if I were to give you a tool and if I tell you this tool can only be used less than 50% of the time, would you say that this is a reliable tool for you to use, especially when it matters the most, which is in competition?
Yeah.
You
wouldn't be proficient with it.
Exactly, right? So you're using the tool less than 50% of the time, right? So I said that I tell lifters, if you cannot at least do 50%, I just use 50% as a very arbitrary number because it's like in the middle, and anything more than that is the majority of the sets, right? Nothing too scientific in the literature that 56% is a P 0.046 significant value. So it's just an arbitrary number. I say like, and conceptually it's like if the tool that you're using cannot be used proficiently for more than half the time, you probably wouldn't be confident using it in the most important time when you actually need the tool. So like Emil started working with more hook grip sets, right? And then obviously we changed the programming up a bit. I don't know whether you want to dive into that, but we also like started deadlifting 3 times a week, right? And that also helped because I think that the hook ability to hook grip, the limiting factor is how much pain your thumb can tolerate, right? So, and once your thumb starts hurting, I think that the pain is quite exponential. So let's just say you can hook grip 3 sets, right? And then after that, the quality of your sets just goes down because of the pain of your thumb. But what if you do, instead of doing 5 sets a day, right, you do 3 sets here, 3 sets on day 2 and another 3 sets on day 3, right? While, there's also the element of, all the debate and discussion that we can have on the impact of the frequency of the deadlifting impacting maximal strength, right? That's a separate conversation, but I think that it also allows that grip practice with slightly less pain, because essentially you're still going to feel pain, but let's not feel pain all the time when we can. When Emil pulled I think when we did his best double in comp, I think he did like 342 for doubles or something. But I say like after that 342 for doubles, my thumb was just so painful, But I'm like, yeah, cool. Like, but that's just once where you hit 342 for doubles, right? And it's painful, right? Rather than, every single session we have to say, okay, cool, you need to pull to the point where your thumbs are literally falling off. So the purpose of hook and grip practice is not to induce pain, right? It's just that that is the kind of like the byproduct or the unintended consequence that, and if you can actually avoid that, right, then that's great, right? And I think that the deadlifting 3 times a week, it actually helped that as well. And I think, I know this is a podcast. Mike, you and I, we never really had like, oh, this is an interview. So I don't know what you think, because obviously, Kasem-san pulls quite frequently with straps, right? So I don't know what are your thoughts on this. So yeah, so that is what I did to kind of like fix the grip issue.
Yeah. It always kind of depends on what the issue is that you're trying to solve. Like, it sounds like in this case, like it's not that Emil's grip was weak necessarily. It sounds like it was partly technical and partly just like you didn't need to do extra grip stuff. You just needed to make the deadlift training you were already doing also more effective for grip. And, that seems to have solved the problem, which, that's been kind of my go-to as well over the years. So, like, I tell everybody this, that, if we have problems with grip, then the best thing to do is holds, deadlift holds. And depending on how bad it is, you may have to start out with lighter holds but the aim point is still to like get to the point where you can do heavier holds, you know. And I'm thinking about like somebody pulling mixed grip right now, but if you can get to the point where you can hold your last rep for an additional 5 seconds, you can do that through all of your extra training, or all, if you can hold the last rep of your work sets for 5 extra seconds all through your training block, you're probably not going to have any sort of issues with your grip in competition either. You know? Now it sounds like Emil didn't necessarily even need to go that far with it. Like it's just, hey, use straps less, and now all of a sudden all the deadlift sets that you do are also more effective for grip strength as well. And that's enough to bring things along. That totally makes sense to me. Fits right in with my current worldview. Would you say that that's kind of, sorry, go ahead, Mel.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to go into the deadlifting 3 times per week because that's quite frequent. But if you want to go on to something else, Mike.
No, I've more or less the same. Like I've noticed that Emil's deadlift has really seemed to have turned a corner. And in my view, it looks like it's turned a corner, you know, and I'm sure there's been a lot of things going on under the surface there. Now, you mentioned deadlifting 3 times a week. You mentioned grip work. I assume those are the 2 biggest levers that you guys have pulled to produce that result in the deadlift.
Yeah, at least I think that is things that we can attribute towards, you know, with more direct link, right? Obviously, there's the influence of structuring the days, blah, 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 all that, you know, asking him to sleep more or sleep better before your deadlift session, you know, things like this, right? That are, you know, slightly more tangentially related, but not completely separate, right? So, but I think that the direct thing that I would attribute it towards would be those 2 factors.
Hey, if Ronnie Coleman was a powerlifting coach, he might have said, everybody wants to build custom training programs, but nobody's got a process for how to do it on the regular. But we do. You see, most coaches rely on trial and error, and that's fine if that's your jam, but we wanted a coherent process. Way back in 2015, when I'd already been coaching for over a decade, I finally had learned enough from enough sources that I was able to put the pieces together into one coherent process. We call it emerging strategies. The bulk of our 16 world record-setting powerlifters set those records using an emerging strategies program. We talk about emerging strategies a ton on this podcast and everywhere. If you ever want a single thorough explanation for how to implement the emerging strategies process, well, that's the emerging strategies course. The emerging strategies course includes 8 modules. That's almost 24 hours of video instruction covering everything. We teach fundamental concepts and basics all the way through integrated examples and case studies. You can watch it at your own pace, as fast or as slow as you want. Oh, and you know the RTS community, our private community that offers you just a stupendous amount of value all on its own? Well, if you enroll in the Emerging Strategies course, you get 6 months of that community membership for free. If you have any questions about some concept, you just post it in the network or jump on a live office hour call with one of our RTS coaches, and you get your answer. If you'd like to enroll or just learn more, to include seeing a full lesson list, all you have to do is go to reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on courses in the main menu. You're going to love it. So how are you structuring like 3 times a week deadlifting? Are these like 3 comp deadlift sessions, or are we including accessory stuff?
So I think it goes to, I first of all, I actually don't, that there's trial and error as well. And there's a little bit of a law towards this because, you know, I don't want to pretend to be a wizard or a genius that saw into a crystal ball and said, okay, this 3 times a week deadlifting will help you deadlift 365 at Sheffield. To a certain extent, we stumbled upon it by chance. You know, after looking at things, I mean, I try not to go off too much on a tangent, but like the role of luck and chance plays a big role in day-to-day life, you know. And, you know, I like I said, on that day itself, right, whether you, like for Emil's last deadlift, it could have gone 2-1 and we might not have gotten it. But so happened it's 2-1, a good lift, you know. So there's a small element of luck as well, right? You know, people always say like, oh, people tend to be, you know, juries tend to be a little bit more strict if they didn't eat their lunch or something like that. So maybe maybe, you know, SBD fed the juries well or something like that. Who knows, right? Like I say, there's always something that you cannot account for. So even stumbling upon this 3 times a week deadlift, there's a small element of chance. And I don't think a lot of people know this because Emil hasn't also really told the story of Emil has attributed the 3 times a week deadlifting to the deadlift success, but he hasn't really gone into how we actually stumbled upon that. So when Emil got the wildcard for Sheffield, we were having a discussion on what would your goal be, right? Because we knew Chell was going to cut down to 66. We knew there was Perkins, and that means that your ability to go on the podium at that time it's not going to be, chances are quite low, right? And even like say up to the previous show, your chances were going to be quite low. So with the information that we knew at that time was like, okay, cool, we want to have fun, right? And then we, as much as we can, we want to try to, take home the biggest prize. So these two elements combined, we know that, like I said, historically, Emil's back has had issues when he starts squatting heavy, right? And we know that he was not going to break the squat record. And therefore, I'm like, okay, cool. If squatting is something that might not be as enjoyable because of pain, nobody likes to train in that high levels of pain. We also will not really have the squat record. Why don't we consider just putting the squat on like maintenance or the back burner, and let's just push your deadlift? Because if you pull like 350 something, right, for doubles, maybe the world record deadlift is within reach, right? So, and to do that, and we also did a calculation to be like, okay, cool. If we manage to bench the bench world record and pull the deadlift record, that's already 10,000 pounds, right? And if you actually get the total world record as well, that's 15,000 pounds, right? So, and whatever placing you are, okay? So we were just talking about our options then, right? Also, like I said, from the perspective of enjoyment as well, because like it's probably, if we dial things back on your squat, if you squat one time a week and we deadlift more, right? Maybe your back also won't flare. The chances of your back flaring up is less because you're not squatting as frequent, so the exposure towards pressure on your back from heavy squatting is less, right? And also one thing to consider as well is when Emil's back aggravated for the squat, it will impact his deadlift, because when you pull the slack, that area doesn't feel good, right? So I'm like, okay, let's find a way to minimize the probability of that happening, but also still put up a decent total. It's not like, okay, cool, I'm just going to sit back and let you tank your squat by 15 kilos, right? So I did some rough calculation, and I said like, okay, cool, if you hit 246 on the 246 on the bench, and the world record deadlift of like 374, if I'm not mistaken, right? And all you have to squat is roughly around 300 or 305, and you still will hit 920, So that's still somewhere around the ballpark, right? You still end up roughly at the same total, but, you just don't have to squat so much if your back's giving you problems, right? So Emil said, okay, cool. I told him, I proposed the idea to him, right? And I said that I want you to think about it, right? I said, this is an option that we can have. This is a path that we can go down. Because first of all, Emil is also not that horribly built that he cannot deadlift, right? He doesn't have like, the shortest arms in the world, So I'm like, then we train as usual. And then I asked Emil, so how do you feel about squats? And squats was actually going really well in that block, despite deadlifting 3 times a week, right? So we just decided to keep that 3 times a week deadlifting and still push the squat anyway. So we decided that, we weren't going to be a deadlift specialist, basically. But we did give it a go at the start, but we found out that we could balance 3 times a week deadlifting with squatting 2 times a week. And naturally, being someone who is more cautious and conservative with any form of change, I also didn't really say, let's go ham on 3 times a week deadlifting while we're squatting twice a week. Because in my head, it's like, if I were to go ham on the 3 deadlift sessions, I'm going to dial back 1 squat session. But now we're just like introducing 3 times a week deadlifting just to see how it goes. Because if 3 times a week deadlifting at a very sort of like controlled, sort of like exposure to stimulus doesn't work, we know we cannot ramp it up anyway. So we started there, and we could balance that with twice a week squatting. And that is how we stumbled upon that. So I said, it's kind of a little bit of a long story to explain the element of like how luck played a role. I haven't even gone to actual like how I structured it yet. So yeah, before I go into like how I structured the thing, is there any like questions?
I just want to add, that doesn't sound like luck. That sounds like thoughtful coaching and creating a hypothesis, a thesis, reasonable exploration parameters of what can we test, what can we yield, and what does success look like. And then reflecting on, okay, since we have this new information, how can we implement it within different parameters that allow us to move another lift? I think less luck and very well thought out. And I think that lifter enjoyment it's come up a few times where like, yeah, I really like deadlifting more. And sometimes coaches get focused on improving the weak lift. But if you are leveraged to do really well, sometimes it's celebrate and push into your strength and just lift the strength via strength. And it sounded like you did a really fantastic job with that.
Mel is currently advocating for 5 times a week squatting for herself. So
we can't
just
we,
let
we
me
can't let
enjoy my training.
yeah we can't let Agatha have all the fun, right? So
Right.
it's also really funny because Agatha stumbled upon 6 times a week SBD because she enjoys it. It's not like she was forced
Yeah.
into it, you know. So
Yeah,
Well,
that's
I
the
mean-
conversation we had with Pablo. Like, yeah, heck yeah, squatting's the best. Heck yeah, all the SBD lifts are the best. Let me do them.
Yeah. I definitely think that is underrated, you know, like training enjoyment. And I will often lean into that, you know, when, you know, unless there's a damn good reason not to, you know, a lifter enjoys X, Y, or Z, then yeah, let's try it. Let's explore that area and see, you know, more often than not, it's worth looking at, you know, like I can't recall very many times when somebody has like really wanted to try a certain strategy and it's just been really not good for them. No, granted, like populations matter, right? You know, and I'm talking about like more experienced powerlifters, more serious powerlifters, and that, you know, have a commitment to progression. And, you know, we're not talking about gym bros maxing out on the bench every day or something like that, but like enjoyment does matter. And kind of, I think there's something to be said for that, almost like a intuition kind of draw.
yeah.
Self-organized programming.
A little bit.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of the actual deadlift structure, I think at least this when I start like writing, you know, or like prescribing training stimulus, right? Put it in that way, right? I always we start with some like very, you know, broad general principles, and then we kind of like see if this sort of like perception of this lifter kind of like fits the principles, right? And if it doesn't, we kind of tweak it. And historically in my years of coaching, and also not just coaching writing programs, but also, you know, coaching on the platform, I do notice that the deadlift, right, does get a slight boost from the taper, right? Or maybe not even a boost, but the decay of a deadlift, or the ability to detrain a deadlift isn't as high as the squat or the bench. You know, what the explanation is, you know, this conversation for another time. But I think that probably tells me that, okay, cool, even if we go 3 times a week deadlifting, we don't really need to go that crazy, right? So I can easily take 2 days of the deadlift days and distribute that and split 1 day into just half. I still keep the primary day, right? And then I take the secondary day and I cut it into half, right? Or maybe I take the primary day and turn the primary day into 80%, right? And then split the secondary day or the second deadlift day into, you know, 50-50, and then combine it to form the third day, something like that, right? So what I'm trying to say is that I didn't really like increase the volume of the totality of the volume, right? Because people in conversations of high frequency training, some people say, oh, it's the high frequency, it's the gains from high frequency as a result of higher training volume because you're just doing more, or is it independent of that? So in Emil's case, I didn't really change things as much. And then I look at the specific demands that Emil requires to actually help him do well in his deadlift. So I think that Emil is a lifter where he has to feel good under the bar, right? Like people will be like, oh, you know, the bar feels light on my hand, or the bar feels light on my back, right? I mean, you know, I never really know what that feels because 120 kilos feel heavy on my back or on my hand, you know, all the time. But for them, it's like, oh yeah, you know, when you know, the feeling when you go under the bar, it's a familiar feeling, right? So you need that sense of familiarity. You know, some people like to call it priming. They need to feel primed going into the session. You know, however you want to, whatever terminology you want to use. So what I have noticed with Emil is that for him to have his main deadlift session to be good, he needs relatively close like exposure a couple of days prior that is enough for him to feel familiar with relatively heavy loads but not too fatiguing, right? So typically what we usually do is I'm starting from day 3, right? So the third day, because day 3 actually carries into day 1, I usually put like pause deadlifts, so ascending set of pauses, right? So I think that being strict on the pauses with ascending sets and with bigger jumps as well, because obviously as a, you know, when you deadlift 300 plus, you can make like 20 plus kilo jumps, right? Allows him to warm up into one heavy like triple or heavy double, right? And that that pause reinforce that position, right? So it provides that stimulus without the sort of like the fatigue or the recovery demands of having a heavy absolute load, right? So we usually do like ascending sets of pauses, and then Emil will do that on Saturday, which is actually his last training day of the week. He rests on Sundays. Monday is actually his primary deadlift day, so that will probably be top sinks. That will usually be a top set, right? A top single or whatever, and then the back off sets tend to be slightly higher in training volume, depending on the total. What I usually do as well is I just do total repetitions. I don't really care on like whatever sets or whatever, right? So it's like, let's just say I try to cap the total volume at around 12 to 16 reps of back off sets. So it could be 4 sets of 4, 3 sets of 5, 3 sets of 4, whatever, right? And with a velocity tracker, I usually said, I'll give you an estimated load. And if the velocity goes under this, you just drop the load to stay within this velocity range for your back off sets. So whatever that, and then obviously the top set would be within certain velocity range as well. So that is the first day of his deadlift. And then the secondary day is actually the easiest day, where I just do very, very like ascending sets of maybe 3s or 4s, right? So I try to keep that total repetitions under 10 reps. So for now, Emil's program is 2 sets of 4, right? So we just do like the 4 reps at maybe 230 and then 4 reps at 250, which is quite light, right? So, and then we just very, very small progressions. And how I usually look at it would be looking at the velocities as well. So from a conceptual perspective, the easiest deadlift session, we shouldn't see a large velocity decline from session to session and even from rep to rep, because what velocity tells me is essentially every rep that's slower, there's some accumulation of fatigue, right? I mean, let's assume that technically it's sound, and I sure hope that when you're deadlifting 225 kilos as a 365 kilo deadlifter, your technique at 225 is so whatever. If your velocity is going down at 225, it's probably likely due towards that you're really, really fatigued. So I try to keep the velocity loss on a rep to rep and also session to session on the third easiest session as minimal as possible, right? Whereas the first session, the primary deadlift session, I'm okay with certain velocity loss for the back off work, because I think that's where we get the chunk of like that sort of like stimulating volume, right? And then the third deadlift session, which is the secondary day, right, can be a bit confusing. The one it does on Saturday, I use it the perspective of like we build up towards a certain velocity, right? So I think how I look at it would be looking at the velocity would tell me how the day is going, but the idea is that you get most of the stimulation from the primary day, which is a top single and X amount of reps of back offs. The second deadlift session, which is on Wednesday, because Emil's primary session is on Monday, he will do something with a very, very basically a range where it's not supposed to induce any noticeable amount of fatigue, right? Because like I said, we keep the velocity loss at minimum as possible. And the last one is that we work up towards a certain set and then we stop there, meaning that theoretically there should not be velocity loss as well, because you're just working up to a point where you think you can actually hit the velocity target for a day. So if we look at the amount of sort of like heavy stimulation, it's only on one day, and both secondary and tertiary deadlift day, I try to keep the repetitions under 10 total. So like I said, right now Emil does 2 sets of 4 and 3 sets of 3 ascending sets, so it's 8 and 9, right? And then for day one, we're doing top triples and then back off sets of 7, 2 sets of 7. So you have a day where you have a total, day one, primary day, you have a total of 17 repetitions. Day 2, you have a total of 8 repetitions. Day 3, you have a total of 9 repetitions, So that if you accumulate all of that, right, 8 plus 9 is 16, 16 plus 17 is 36, right? So you do a total of 36 reps throughout the entire week, which, isn't really that much, You can do 36 reps in 2 sessions because that's 18 reps per session, right? 18 reps per session is like, 3 sets of 6. You can do that in 2 sessions as well. So that's kind of like how I structure it. And for Emil, like I said, this might be surprising if people watch Emil training leading into Sheffield. Obviously, plug to his channel, go and watch his channel, because one thing that I'm really happy for him is that he's starting to build a following, which I think is important for him, because I can basically I've also been trying to find Emil a supplement sponsor, which is pretty wild because of I think language barrier and being Eastern in the Eastern European country. Like Emil doesn't have a supplement sponsor, and not just Emil but Agatha as well. If you think about these lifters who have been podiuming at Worlds, they have no supplement sponsor, whereas you have other lifters, and this is not a knock on them, that they've never like they're not even in prime time in Worlds, but they have like supplement sponsors, you know. So I'm just like, and I
Correct.
understand it's just due to geography and language and whatever. So, you know, go and follow Emil. But Emil's last training at Sheffield on the day before, which is 2 days out, right? So Sheffield was on Sunday. On Friday, Emil did 305 pause deadlift single, right? And that was the idea of creating that stimulus that's enough that also doesn't generate fatigue. We just did three singles working up to a top set, because typically, like I said, we do 3 sets of 3, right? So we allow the volume to taper down. So instead of doing 3 sets of 3, we just do 3 sets of 1. And they put 305 for single. And that was his last deadlift before the competition. And some people will be like, oh, you know, it's too heavy, right? How can you pull like less? And I mean, Emil did 365. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know, right? Would it be better if I did it 3 days out? Maybe. Would it be better if I maybe only did 295? I don't know. But clearly the outcome is not that. It's not horrible, right? So, and sometimes accepting not horrible is good enough, at least for now.
Well, hold on. I think you need a little more credit than you're giving yourself. I understand why
Hundred-
you take the position that you're taking, but at the same time, like there's you can't know. I know you know all this, but just to kind of explain the position a little bit more, like a lot of this stuff, like we can't know as like verifiable fact, and there's just no way to know these things. Like you can't test the
There's no
entire
control
field of
version of yourself.
possible. Yeah, like that. Yeah, exactly. That you have a control issue. Like, you know, even if you run these tests sequentially, like you're a slightly different lifter than you were in the last block or last year or something like that. So there's that going on. And so you just can't test everything. So you can't know with like verifiable certainty. But if you've got a lifter who's experienced and who comes into competition and deadlifts, 335 to 345 in every competition that you do for a couple years, and then they come to a competition and deadlift 365, that's worth paying attention to. Could it be something extraneous, some other? Yeah, it could be. But, if it was random luck, I don't know, like, would it have happened at some other time? Like you like, the longer the tail goes where things are stagnant, the more convincing it seems to me that when the stagnation finally breaks, there's a there
It's a very,
there.
very
There-
powerful sample.
Yeah, like, I mean, to make it about me for a second, like I've seen this in my own training where things seem to be really stagnant for a long time. And I mean, I'm talking about like a couple of years. You go maybe a couple of years and you don't hit a PR or something like that, and then you finally do. Is that just dumb luck? Like, oh well, the things finally got around to having the training effect. Like you just stick to it long enough, and yeah, maybe that's it. But also, like I made some very deliberate changes that are intended to address a certain issue. That seems at least equally likely, So anyway, all that to just to say that I think what you're suggesting, not only does it make a lot of sense from a logical standpoint, I think you have the strongest kind of evidence that is possible for us to have here. So it's definitely worth paying attention to. And just to kind of come back around to like my own understanding of what you were saying, it sounds like, you know, 3 times a week deadlifting includes, your primary session, which is training the competition exercise in probably the most stimulating way. That's probably the most difficult session of the week. And there's a secondary day where you're doing pause deadlifts, ramping things up. That's, stimulating probably, but not fatiguing really. You're not like generating like a measurable amount of fatigue from that, like within that single workout. And then the third deadlift day sounds like it's coming a couple days before the next primary deadlift day, and it's lighter, more snappy, more focused on velocity, even less fatiguing than the pause deadlifts probably. And that one probably really is focused on not even really providing a stimulus in terms of further adaptation, but mostly preventing like technical degradation.
Decay.
Yeah.
Decay.
So I think that the sequence, like it might be just me not explaining it properly, but the sequence, the days are right, but the sequence is split. So the primary day is Monday.
Oh, okay.
Okay. The post deadlift day is Saturday, which is the secondary day in terms of importance, right? But it's the third
Got it.
deadlift in chronological order, right? And then the one where it's like no, let's just say the no fatigue session or the velocity, the velocity session, that is the second deadlift session, but the tertiary in terms the third in terms of importance, which is in the middle. So Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. Monday is the stimulating one. On Wednesday is the velocity one, and the Saturday would be the one that we call it the priming one, which is the ascending pause. So that's kind of like the sequence.
Yeah, like almost like the Saturday is to challenge technique to prime you
Yes.
for the
Yep.
heavy day. And then that a third deadlift session is really to prevent skill decay. And also, since you're looking for velocity, you're also checking about overall fatigue. Because if velocity starts to plummet on that day,
Yep.
that's a good check to see, like, okay, Emil is QAing fatigue. And it prevents skill decay. It's a check in on current fatigue levels, as well as it's just practice in the competition lift.
Yep, 100%. I think it's also like a good middle of the week, like because it's on a Wednesday, right? So I think essentially when I look at the entire structure, obviously we're looking at deadlift, is I look at individual sessions and what this session tells me about the others. Because I mean, Emil basically trains like this. Monday we do deadlifts, right? Tuesday we do secondary squats. Emil squat twice a week, so that's only secondary and primary. Then Wednesday would be the tertiary deadlift, which is the one that you just mentioned, right? So it's the easiest deadlift session, and essentially that tells me after that session, like from a perspective of like not going too heavy, just because he's been doing lower body training for his third day training session in a row, right? So and then he rests one day on Thursday, and then his primary squats is on Friday, right? And then he's sort of like priming deadlift is on a Saturday. So the middle of the week deadlift gives me like a nice checkpoint to kind of evaluate where his fatigue levels are, right? And I think that during the peak because like I say, this is very experimental to a certain extent. What I've done with Emil is that I've usually write his training block, right? Every week I only update the first 3 days, and I just copy and paste Friday and Saturday, and based on how he feels on that deadlift on the Wednesday, I would then change what Friday and Saturday would look like, because like I said, that gives me a checkpoint to be like, okay, cool, this is how he's feeling, right? And then obviously we see that we like generally after a while you establish a certain sort of pattern that if Emil feels this way on a Wednesday, right? Maybe Thursday, one day of rest is not enough, right? And if he has to absolutely train on a Friday I have to dial things back down slightly, right? Or if not, if we can push the training back. Instead of resting only on Thursday, we rest Thursday, Friday, and push the training back by one day, right? Things like that. So it is like the way I see it is that every session kind of like generates a certain signal, and how we use that signal and integrate that into the larger sort of like planning structure, that is also important. So I think that for people kind of like, listening out there and like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna like listen to these 3 people talking about deadlifting 3 times a week and copy the program, it really, I don't want to make it too complicated than it really is, because it's powerlifting. But like, it's not just I'm deadlifting 3 times a week, therefore I'm making the gains. But it's in the context of Emil trying to improve his squat and his deadlift and potentially break the world record. This is what we needed to do.
Well, then it sounds like as well, like you're making these micro adjustments as you go, which as time goes on, I think there's a lot more importance to that than maybe it gets credit for. And you may think, I think a lot of people will think that, how big of a difference can that make, right? Like you tweak the training load or the training volume up or down a little bit, or add an extra rest day here and there. Like, how much does that really affect things? Well, I mean, I think on the whole, kind of a lot. It just the same as like making smart weight selections affects things. Maybe not so much for next week. It's not going to make a night and day difference within the next, 7 to 10 days, but you stack up good decisions, and that can make a big difference at the end of the block. You start stacking up successful blocks, and that makes a big difference over time. That by making a good choice, and a good choice that's also a difficult choice of like holding the weight back an extra 2.5 or 5 kilos today so that we're not inducing too much fatigue or something like that, means that we can make a slightly more aggressive choice next week and build the momentum, and good decisions can compound on each other versus you know I guess what I'm getting at is just that kind of compounding. It's not taken in isolation. And I would say, like what you're talking about, evaluating and tweaking as you go based on the signals that you're getting is really, really important to the overall outcome.
And I think I I don't want this to make it seem like everybody listen and every coach out there or every lifter should overanalyze everything to the point. But like I said, this was experimental in nature with therefore I'm paying attention like that because I'm also involved in the experiment. It's very different if I have already established certain structure and I can just tell the lifter if X then Y, and they can actually respond. Like I said, we never done deadlift 3 times a week. We're going for potentially one of the biggest competitions in the world with the biggest goals that you had, right? And like I said, we also have to balance between your, navigating through your past history of pain doing certain lifts, right? Because like I said, going into the primary squat, if Emil feels pain, it'll probably snowball in the different direction. So if I can make it snowball in the right direction, that would be good. And I don't want this to, I'm not an apologist I'm not trying to be an apologist for like, you should optimize every single thing and you shouldn't have any like hardship, But I also don't think that you need to make everything hard. And if you don't make everything hard, it means you're a loser, right? It's like, just because you're going to go boxing, right? And you're going to get your head punched doesn't mean your training should be getting able to punch your head every single time. So there's that fine line. I'm not saying that you have to optimize every single thing, but there's the thing that in the context of like, if we know what the limiting factor is and if that is pain and enjoyment, I'm going to try my best to optimize to reduce that because that is the biggest bottleneck. So, and I'm not trying to overanalyze things to optimize things. Say, oh yeah, if like your world is going to end if this is happening, because I think that there is also building resilience. And I think that this goes out to Emil as well, because I would tell Emil, like Emil's very disciplined, right? And I think that he's very committed. And obviously you have to be committed and disciplined to the extent to achieve that kind of level. And he hates changing the program, right? And I'm the kind, I'm like, and I'm saying it's okay to change the program. So it's very different. There are some lifters that, I want to change the program all the time. Let's move this here, let's move this there. Sometimes I'm guilty of that. But Emil's the kind like, I would like, unless the world is ending, I'm not going to change the program. So that growth for him is to sometimes understand that it's okay to change the program. But I always provide a way for him to stick to the plan. I said, if you go into the session, like let's say you fall sick or you had a massive week of handling at nationals, right? Because Emil also helps organize nationals. He's involved in his own powerlifting community in Bulgaria, right? I'm not going to say don't go to nationals and don't grow. Just focus on yourself. Don't care about anybody else but yourself. I'm not going to say sacrifice that, but I'm like, okay, if you feel tired and you're warming up on your deadlifts and it doesn't feel good, just go on to bench. We just deadlift tomorrow. But I think for Emil, but I said that this can also be perceived in a way that if you really want to lift X amount of weight on this day, you need to show me that you can lift X amount of weight. So as you're warming up, things are moving well, right? And you feel good, which means that maybe after the nationals, you need to eat slightly better, you need to sleep better. Maybe you need to, instead of jumping into training immediately, like, you just work all day, because, Emil he does online coaching as well. So instead of like staying in front of the computer and working all day and immediately after you finish your last program, you just run to the gym. Maybe you need to like take a break, maybe 20, 30 minutes, right? Get your mindset right. Right. Those are things that you can kind of like work on to see if you can actually express their strength. If one side of your, like let's just say you have like something in the equation that is not, the output is not there, you have to kind of like find other ways to see if you can actually increase the output in other ways, right? So it's also a challenge for the lifter, right? To say that what else can I do if I really want to lift this weight on this day, So it's not just like, oh yeah, you're weak today, we just skip. And then every time you feel weak, you just skip your session. It's actually not like that, right? I think that it's also a way we communicate with our lifters on what is an acceptable amount of feeling weak on that day before we think that that session will not be productive, right? Like you said, Mike, it's all compounding and stacking the sessions,
Man, that resonates with me very much. Like that, there are certain instances where you come to a session fatigued and you should definitely push and do it anyway. And then there comes a point where it isn't like building your resilience anymore. It's just wasting a session, And as I've kind of built my dynamic load management system over the years, part of that has been trying to really clearly articulate what is that threshold. Like there is a threshold there where you should still push, and then beyond that threshold, yeah, we need to make some sort of change, and that change can come in a variety of different forms. But where are those lines? And it's really hard to nail that down. And what it's showed me is that the it's not a bright line, you know. And the way I take it in my own system is similar to the way you described what Emil does, is maybe my system will kind of kick back to me the same sort of suggestion, like, oh, well, today was originally planned to be a deadlift day, but there's too much fatigue, so we're gonna punt and we'll try to deadlift tomorrow. And I'll do very similar things where I'll show you, God damn it, and I'll maybe have a bit of extra caffeine or turn the music up a little extra loud and do it anyway. And I mean, yeah, that can have a cost too, but if it does, then I'll find out tomorrow and we'll make some further adjustments. And, you do continually, like, just because it's not a bright line doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. At
Yep.
some point you are very clearly over the line, and it becomes an easier decision to make, I mean, and that's happened in a variety of different ways too. Like sometimes you're warming up and dealing with some sort of a pain issue, and, Mel, we've had sessions back in Washington that were like that for me as well, like where I was warming up and feeling some sort of issue and thinking like, do I pivot and just maybe I should just do something else today and find a different accessory movement that I actually can do, or do I take the risk and go ahead and push ahead? And I mean, yeah, that is a decision that has to be made, and there is a right and wrong to it, and you won't know until after. It's just how it goes sometimes.
Athlete personality too. Like you were saying, Kedric, is the athlete showing up and wanting to make the session as successful as possible? And as they come into those fatigue days, are they reevaluating everything that led up to it and trying to make it a session that can be successful within the parameters of like realistic expectations? If they're an athlete that's easily swayed to push it off, then likely they're an athlete that'll need a bit more pushback with resilience. If they're an athlete that's staring at the bar, feeling pain and like, no, I want to lift the weight. Give me the session I want. You got to lean into knowing yourself a bit there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think understanding the lifter, I think, this also, I mean, of course, another highlights at Sheffield was Chell making 66 and winning Sheffield, right? And I had conversations with Chell about that, and, basically when he decided to go to 66, and he asked me, what do you think I can total? And so he said that, I said to him, I'm like, there isn't really a point for me telling you right now, because if I tell you what I think right now, 2 weeks down the road, you still ask me the same question, and that number would change and shift around, and we're so far out, it doesn't really matter, And sometimes when he asked me, what do you think I can total, I said, like, this is what I realistically can do. And when it comes to Chell, if you speak to him, you listen to the podcast with King of the List, or any podcast he's on, he's a dreamer, right? He's a dreamer, right? He dreams a lot. And I think that's why he's turning 37 and is still competing at one of the, highest level in the sport, right? Because he has big dreams, right? And I think that my role as a coach is that he probably can dream things bigger than I could ever dream. So I don't need to be a dreamer for him. What I need to be is that sometimes I need to be the voice of reason to bring him back down to earth. Sometimes it's like, this is things that are achievable within this time frame, but on the flip side, there might be a lifter that is always be like, oh, I'm really afraid, I can't do this, I can't do that. My role then is not to be skeptical, right? Because you're already so skeptical on your own performance, right? My role is then to say, you can do better, right? My role then is to be the dreamer to help that person be a dreamer. So it's just really understanding that, like you said, the lifter's personality, right? And how the person responds. So I think all those are very, very important factors that also goes into the fact of what does a lifter enjoy, right? We go back to the conversation of lifters' enjoyment. Different personality types would enjoy different things. And I'm not saying that every single session should be enjoyable, because there will be some point where you have to push. The training will be hard. Being a world champion is not easy, right? That's why I'm not doing it, and I'm telling you to do it, because it's so much easier for me to talk and tell you rather than me doing it, So yeah, and I think it's probably also not easy for me to edit my genes, but I think that the way I kind of like look at training now is very like the paradigm I look at training or programming is very, very different. I think that a lot of people, and I mean, when I say a lot of people, it's just a generalization. This is not an empirical fact, but people think of it as like we look at training as a sort of like from a very like positive perspective, like what can I do to stimulate this? But how I look at things is that what are the limiting factors that I can reduce? Because it's very easy to create stimulation. You do 10 by 10, you create stimulation, right? GBT. Like it's not hard to create a stimulus, like even a dumb stimulus is a stimulus, but a dumb stimulus would come with many, many other limiting factors. It might result in injury, it might result in not enjoying, right? Like limiting factors does not just boil down towards the byproduct of the fatigue from training, but it also comes to what are your leverages, right? What is your nutrition like? What is your sleep like? So how many of these are actually things that we can address, right? And which is the one that we need to address first? For example, like Chell, people say, oh yeah, why do Chell has to do all this weighted walks, all that? I say, like, to be honest, like I said, this is another huge experiment. I don't know what the outcome would be, but I know that if he doesn't make weight, I'm kind of screwed. So, but if you look back, he sleeps like 5 to 6 hours a day, right? He has like young children. So I'm like, could it be possible that right now these are certain limitations that we cannot address? Certain problems cannot be solved in this moment, right? And sometimes you just have to find other limitations where you can where you can address. So could it be the fact that if let's just say child is sleeping 9 hours a day, he probably would not need to be on so low calories, because within the time frame that he has to lose weight, maybe if he were to have higher calories, he will still lose that weight, but it will take maybe twice as long. But Sheffield will not wait for you, right? So I think that at the end of the day, like I said, the paradigm the way I look at is I see that what are those things that are limiting this person from making progress, and let's see what I can kind of address, right? And also acknowledging that there are certain problems that I cannot solve. Going back to the 66 kilo weight class with Kyoda, right? Kyoda used to work as a firefighter, and he, Mike, I told you this before, he works 24-hour shifts, right? So I'm always stuck between a rock. Basically, his shifts are 24 hours on, 24 hours off. So I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. Should I give him his hardest training session after 24 hours off, which means he's well rested going to the session? But the dilemma is that after giving his hardest session, he will not be able to recover from it because he's 24 hours on. He doesn't get to sleep, right? So that is a problem that I cannot solve. And how did I solve that problem? I didn't. He just quit his job, Like that problem solved itself through time. He just stopped being a firefighter, And I don't think it's coincidental that he finally managed to, bump the world record up to 725 before Chell obliterated it, right? I'm not saying that I did any of that, because I definitely would not. I don't have the authority to ask someone to quit their job for powerlifting, but how did that problem solve itself? Not through me. It's just through time he decided that I wanted to do something else, and he stopped being a firefighter, or at least stop doing anything that has crazy shifts, So like that is kind of like how I see things. And I think it goes back to like the enjoyment thing, because the lack of enjoyment, right, can also be a limiting factor, right? We've seen lifters, high level lifters, right, stop powerlifting or taking a break from powerlifting because after a while they just don't enjoy it anymore. And that, if you think about it, right, on a spectrum of progression, right, let's just say we decide to X amount of progress in X amount of time. When you decide to take a break, your progress goes to zero. And then the limiting factor at that point is like the lack of enjoyment. So that shows you how much enjoyment can actually play. Because if you just compound the entire timeline and just say this person made 500 kilos over the span of 10 years, it means you make 50 kilos a year. But if you take 2 years off, right, and you still make the same amount, that you might be taking additional 20-30% to make the same amount of progress. But the fact of the matter is that enjoyment was that limiting factor at that point, right? So I think that enjoyment, the way you communicate, the way you keep the athlete sort of like involved in the process, right, is also good. I think like proposing different pathways of like, this is what you can potentially do at Sheffield, right? That also I think it made Emil excited, right? Even though we ultimately didn't go down that path, but he also said that, oh, there are options, So that's kind of like a lot of the chaos that goes in my head when I kind of like try to piece things together.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's problem solving to me. Like you solve the problem that's in front of you, and that's by definition contextual. And I'm sure you get questions, and I get questions about what if scenarios, and those are always hard to answer because they lack contextual clarity. There's like the way to solve the problem in general, but then when you're dealing with a real person, there's usually a lot more detail that comes into the picture. And sometimes I also like your acknowledgement that sometimes there's just not much you can do. Like, this is a problem, I can't control it, so we're going to do the best we can within the rest of the framework, and it just is what it is until something changes.
Yeah, I think like the approach, like I don't know whether this is just doing the coaching. I mean, I can't really say that, like, doing coaching for so long. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm talking to Mike T. Like, I kind of like got into coaching when I started reading Mike T when he was already doing coaching for years. So I can't really say I've been doing coaching for so long. But like I said, the approach to like coaching in general is like, for me, I think to continue to go down the continue to enjoy my work, right? It's just like I have to kind of like reframe the way I see things, and I mean, maybe throughout the conversation, the two of you might be able to tell that, like, I do have a slight like skepticism, right, on the things that I do. And I also think because that you often fall between the spectrum, like you attribute everything to be like, oh yeah, this is because of me, this is because I gave him 10 reps instead of 8, things like that, right? You're overconfident and attribute the causation to something that is probably doesn't really matter. But for myself, I try to, like I said, acknowledge the role of luck, acknowledge that there are certain problems that you cannot solve. And I think that also acknowledging that as coaches, right, there will always be an error in judgment. I think speaking to lifters, I have interesting conversations all the time. When like I said, when Chell asked me about the total, he said, what do you think I can total? Then I usually said, with certain level of certainty, this is, I think, the range that you will fall in. Then I would say, like, first of all, if you ask me, I'll never give you 100% certainty, because I think that the quote that I came out with, and hopefully this is not some plagiarized quote from something I read, but I said that people always have to leave room for an error in judgment, and to not leave room for an error in judgment is itself an error in judgment. So I said you always have to leave room that you might be wrong, right? And it's okay. And sometimes, but the things that you probably don't want to be wrong all the time, right? Because if you are wrong all the time, maybe your framework of evaluating stuff have to change. Right? But I think that it's okay sometimes to be wrong, and it's not the end of the world, right? And fingers crossed, the time when you're wrong is not when the time it matters the most, because there have been instances where people have done, I mean, without naming any names, that there are certain decisions that was made at Sheffield that the lifters were not happy because the coach made a wrong decision when it comes to attempt selection, right? That's an instance of something being wrong at the crucial moment, right? And I think as coaches, we can only minimize that probability from happening, and that takes time. That goes through experience, honing our skills, reflection, right? And that minimizes the time when the error of judgment actually manifests itself. And that's all we can do, but we probably always have to acknowledge that we are not infallible, we're not, so I think that is kind of like the attitude that I take now. And I think that it's quite exciting as well, right? Because there's always more to explore, because I'm like, okay, cool. If I'm wrong now, what went wrong? It means that there probably is a gap on what I know and what I don't. What is that gap? Let's try to figure it out, and I think that keeps me
the joy of getting better. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm not the best coach I can be right now, so
Yeah.
there is room, and here is a direction I can go, and that
Yeah.
makes it exciting.
Exactly. Like, it's always trying to find the thing, which is like, I think, like, the thing that I always tell people about Mike, right? Let's just say, like, about Mike is that Mike is the only lifter that I know that coaches at a high level and compete at a high level, and also coaches himself for the longest time in the world. I don't know how you actually like do that, because I'm like, cool, I just go into the gym, and like I said, I don't pretend to know how I know how you think, but through our numerous conversations that we have over the years, I kind of have an idea of, like, to a certain extent, how your brain works. So I'm like, how does, like, Mike does this for the longest time, And I'm like, first of all, Mike also has kids, I'm like, usually people want to go into the gym, and like, I just want to like lift and not think about anything, because I'm about thinking about every other thing, all other times of my life. But you're literally like working when you're lifting, because you're like self-coach, So I honestly, that is the thing that really like boggles my mind, because I know that I will never be able to do it, I don't know, Mel, whether you are able to do it if you put yourself in Mike's shoes. Like I said, and just not doing it for 1 year. You'll be doing it for like what? I don't know how many years. I can't even count.
You can accomplish a lot with the right amount of obsession, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was really well put too, in general, on just coaching philosophy. And I heard a quote that reminds you that is that all models are wrong, but they are useful tools. And
Yeah.
as you coach, you do create models and you do create parameters to help you check. And at the end of the day, you are the one making the decision based on the models. You cannot be infallible. There's nothing that's going to tell you with 100% certainty this is the correct answer. But you get pretty good after some experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that quote's from George Box. So, I think that it's very like it's good to just think about it, right? Like, things like I think Mike, one of our previous conversations, we talk about like epistemic humility, just knowing what you know,
Yeah.
acknowledging the limitations that you have, right? Even maybe there's a point when you just go into like radical skepticism where you say, oh, we can't really know anything, like I don't even know if, Mike actually exists in front of me, or am I in a simulation or whatever, but I think like, understanding that when we are like, as coaches, what we do is that we generally are building our map, right? So, and we always say like the map is not the territory, right? Because the map is a reduction of the territory. And I think we, as coaches, we kind of like expand our map, right? We start drawing representations of the territory when we start working with different lifters, and we are actually like populating and making our map more robust. But we always have to remember that that map is not the territory, because when you actually enter into the coaching process, then you're entering into that territory. And the fact of the matter is that how you navigate that territory would then, it's like almost like a circular relationship, because it then kind of like evaluates it changes how you plot your next like territory in the map, right? So the more you do things, you kind of like make your map slightly more robust, and you have more general representations of what a certain reality might look like for certain lifters, because working with X amount of lifters, you generate a certain archetype, which helps us make efficient decision-making process. But I think to acknowledge the fact that there will be times when you have to change that, I think that's very, very important. And I think a sign of a good coach or a good problem solver in general is like knowing when to stick to it, right? And when to change things, because you can also go down the route of just changing everything and just throwing everything at the wall and hopefully something sticks, So yeah, I think that is kind of like the coaching mentality that I have. And maybe right now in this stage of what I'm coaching, a certain framework where I evaluate things makes more sense for me. I'm not saying, the fact of the matter is that I wouldn't like recommend this for young upcoming coaches to like, oh, I'm going to question every single thing and, and go down this route, because I do think that you need certain experience and knowledge under your belt before you can, like, you need the principles, right? Then you can start looking at the methods when you have the principles. But if you don't even have the principles, all the methods would not make sense to you. So who knows, maybe 5 years down the road, the 5 years down the road, I evaluate coaching, the way I coach lifters would be very, very different, right? And I think that shows like kind of like the evolution of coaches in general. So yeah, this is kind of just how I'm kind of like evolving. I'm not saying that this is the right path for every aspiring coach out there.
I mean, you don't have to say it, I guess, but I'll say it, that I think the path of having a little epistemic humility is definitely a good way to go as a coach. And like I would say that not doing that is the wrong way to go, and it's probably not just coaching, it's probably just, I don't know, I think life in general across the board would be better if people had a little more epistemic humility in all areas of their life. People are much too certain of things that they have no business being certain over. Even things that you're presumably an expert about. Like, ironically, that's probably where you see it the most. Like, the most epistemic humility is from people who actually have expertise in an area. They go, wait a minute, like, I've been doing this a long time. I'm pretty good at this, but, this is on the periphery of my understanding. And people with much less knowledge and experience have a lot more confidence in things they have no business being confident about. I mean, Dunning-Kruger is a thing, right? Yeah. I think that keeps you learning and progressing as you go too. Like, it makes you able to learn from your own mistakes. Every professional coach has clients that they fail to succeed with, fail to succeed. The clients that they're, it doesn't work out. They're not able to kind of get that progression going. And it's worth it to be able to step back and look at it and say, what went wrong here? Maybe maybe it is the lifter's fault. They just didn't listen to me or something like that. But I mean, I have not seen any of that myself. It almost always comes back to there's something I could learn here. There's something I could do better, even if it boils down to decisions that they made. There's something I could do to frame things better, be alert to certain problems earlier, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, always kind of coming back to what can I learn from this situation? How can I do it better next time? That leads you to the exploring the territory bits that you were talking about, but doing it in a way that's not just smelling your own farts, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I in general, I think like the scientific method was kind of like, at least the scientific method that we know of today is kind of like born out of that as well, right? I think if we go back, kind of like trace back towards like the history of philosophy, right? You always have how people used to reason back, back in the days. We call this camp like the rationalists, right? They reason from like first order logic and principles, a priori principles, like the law of non-contradiction, and you start from there, right? Some like certain like deductive reasonings and all that. But what happened was, like Francis Bacon, who's kind of like, people term him like the father of like empiricism, right? Essentially, it came out from like the like sort of like a Christian Protestant tradition where he basically said like, due to the fall of man, right? Like man falling, right? Whatever, it means that our reasoning skills might actually have some defect, right? So instead of purely using pure reason, right, and placing huge emphasis on our reason, why not we use certain experience, which in the end evolve into experimentation, right? So it's like, then we see like, okay, cool. If we can repeat this time and time again, right, then it gives us higher level of certainty that this will happen, because it goes back to the problem of Hume's problem of induction, right? Like, just because the sun rises every day, right? How do I know if it will rise again tomorrow? I mean, but Hume also had a very weird theory of causation, but that's different. But like I said, it's like that like modern science actually came out from the perspective of there might be something faulty, right? Maybe people can quibble about whether that's even a theologically sound point, that there is like, because of the fall of man, there's like some problem with us being able to reason with high level of certainty. Therefore, we need a different method to kind of like help us be more confident in the things that we can reason, and that is how empiricism was born, right? So experimental method of like trial and testing, so like that. And a lot of people, I think, listening to the podcast, hopefully people do place some authority in like scientific experiments, and just knowing that origins is like, oh, it's not like I created the scientific method to prove myself right. It's actually, the scientific method was born out of the humility that we might be wrong. Therefore, I need something more reliable than myself. And that's how the scientific method was kind of like birthed out, right? So I think that should tell us a lot of how we should actually think about training itself, or even just our recommendations. It's just like, I'm not doing something to prove myself right, because I think when it comes to coaches, we can always very easily impose our goals on the lifter, and I'm like, I'm doing this, I must always be right. I'm doing this, therefore I'm right. But sometimes that is not the case. We can be wrong, and it's okay to be wrong. And maybe sometimes when we're wrong, something good would actually come out of it if we can acknowledge our, like I said, our limitations. Yeah. Going back to the thing of what are the limiting steps that prevents the lifter from progressing. And sometimes the limiting steps might be the coach, and sometimes the coach just has to admit that I have to change something, right? Because that could be a limitation as well, right? And I don't think I'm immune to that. So, but what I can do is, like I said, I try to minimize that as much as I can.
Yeah, it reminds me, and I work as well with engineers and trades, and the engineers are very practical. And sometimes they will create something that cannot physically exist. And it becomes a learning where the trade comes up and said, we can't actually build that. It's physically impossible. And the engineer, you can see they have to reroute and then really think about the experiment of what they're designing play out in real life, and then come back and then reevaluate their reasoning. Like, okay, I reasoned it. It was a thing that could be a successful outcome, but the reality didn't play out that way. So I have to adapt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I like the idea of, you have to fit your framework to the reality that you see in front of you. And sometimes it's that your framework is, a bit too limited. that's something that, I talk about quite a bit. I want to be in a position where if I'm working with an athlete, whatever it is that they need athletically to develop is something that, I am familiar with and that I can, wield competently from a coaching position. Like I don't want to be, only the RPE guy, that everything I write is RPE and, well, what we need is something that's not RPE because for whatever reason we can't use that effectively, well, I'm out of tools at that point. Like, well, it's not a very durable coaching position to sit in, so it's, and it's not just that, it's all these things, it's all the differences in frequency and differences in signal interpretation and training modification that we're talking about this whole time. Well, man, I had, as is often the case with our podcasts here, I had more questions to ask you, but I don't think we're going to get around to everything. So we'll have to have yet another sequel with Kedric Kwan. It's always enjoyable to compare notes, and I thank you for your willingness to engage on a variety of these different topics, from the nuts and bolts of training related topics to controversial calls on the internet and things like that. Thanks for engagement on all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it for having me back. I really enjoy speaking to you. Hopefully, Mel, hopefully you didn't feel too left out, because usually when I have the podcast, it was just like Mike and myself. So I tend to go off on a tangent. But yeah, I appreciate the two of you being here. I think that the conversation is definitely very, very insightful when more people with, constructive thoughts chime in and we can all share our opinions and, like I said, comparing notes. And yeah, I just appreciate it. And I look forward towards the next time I can go off tangent, and actually have people listen to me, because they have no choice, because they invited me on the podcast. So, but I know if I don't get invited back, then that's another signal that I have to, that's a signal,
Yeah, put that into your framework of reality.
Yeah.
No, thanks again, man. Thanks, Mel, for being here. And thanks, everybody, for watching and listening. We'll see you all next time. Hey, let me tell you something that I know about you. Your lifting is important to you. It's probably one of your biggest priorities. And for people like us, nothing compares to the feeling that you get when you set a new PR. That feeling of being the best that you've ever been, of doing something that you've never done before. This is what we're all after, and it's also what RTS specializes in. Getting you the absolute best program possible so that you can hit new PRs and reach your goals. We call it radically individualized training, and we're really good at it. Whether we need to account for busy schedules or equipment limitations, or precisely turn the dials and get the details of the program just right, we have the tools and the experience to guide your lifting to the next level. To us, coaching is all about leadership, relationship, and creative problem solving. A coach should be poised to help you make tough decisions about training and competing so that you can continually grow in your development. And of course, a coach should be a first-rate problem solver, especially when it comes to your training, technique, and strategy. Now, all this has to be built off of a really strong, professional coaching relationship that emphasizes trust and respect. Additionally, RTS coaches are not on an island. We have a strong network of professionals to reach out to, so if you find yourself in need of some specific expertise, say in the realm of nutrition or injury management or sports psychology, there's a deep expertise available there too. For more information, go to store.reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on coaching. That's store.reactivetrainingsystems.com, then click on coaching. Hope to see you on the team soon.